One of my earliest memories from my childhood was in Kaffa. The salt spray on my face was a bitter welcome. After weeks of the ship's relentless rocking, of the stench of fear and unwashed bodies, the land itself felt like a cruel joke. Kaffa, the word was a harsh whisper on the wind, a name I'd heard murmured by my captors, often accompanied by a chilling clinking of coins. If I thought the journey had been the worst of it, the gulag of the sea, I was a fool. The port was a monstrous beast, all cacophony and chaos. The air was thick with the cries of gulls, the shouts of men in a dozen languages I didn't understand, the creak of timber, and the pervasive cloying smell of fish, spices and something else. Something human and despairing. We were herded off the ship like cattle, our legs still trembling from disuse. My rough clothes clung to me, grimy and tearing, a second skin of shame. I clutched the faded locket around my neck, the only piece of my old life they hadn't stripped away. Then came the waiting. Lines formed, not for bread, not for water, but for assessment. Here, in this sprawling marketplace, faces bore the same vacant, terrified expression as my own. Families were ripped apart without a word, children clinging to skirts, then torn away. My turn came, inevitably. A large man with a thick beard and eyes like flint examined me. Not my face, not my eyes, but my teeth, my limbs, the strength in my young frame. He prodded, he poked, he lifted my chin, measuring. What? My value? My capacity for work? My suitability for a life I couldn't yet fathom? I was just 15, perhaps less, a girl from Ruthenia, my name buried under layers of fear and new identities. Here, I was merely it. The numbers scrawled on a parchment, the grunt the man gave, the clink of coins. That was me. A tax was paid, a fee collected, for the privilege of owning a piece of a human soul. I watched it happen, detached, as if observing a stranger. This was the first price settled for me, but far from the last. Then came the deeper indignity. We were moved to another stall, more private, yet even more exposed. Women, older, with cold, practiced hands, stripped us, one by one. There was no gentleness, no privacy. My body, which had been mine, was now an object to be meticulously scrutinized. Every curve, every muscle, every scar. They checked for virginity, for flaws, for anything that might lessen the profitability of their new acquisition. The chill of the air on my naked skin was nothing compared to the chill in my heart. I gritted my teeth, summoning every last spark of defiance. They can take my clothes, my name, my freedom, I vowed silently, as their fingers probed with clinical precision. But they will not take my spirit. I will not break. When it was over, and the chill wind found its way back to my exposed skin, I was given new, rough garments. I was still nameless, still a commodity. But something had hardened within me. A fire, banked by despair, flickered brighter. I would survive this. I would endure. For whatever lay ahead, be it palace walls or the auction block, I would face it. I was no longer merely the girl from Ruthenia. In the harsh crucible of Kaffa, Roxelana, was beginning to be forged. The journey from Kaffa was a blur of cramped quarters and the relentless rocking of a ship. Days bled into nights, each one punctuated by the guttural shouts of guards and the whispered prayers of other captured girls. We were cargo, delivered, not guests. Then came the blinding light of Istanbul. The city rose from the water like a dream woven from domes and minarets, a stark contrast to the bleakness of Kaffa. But the beauty was cold, intimidating. Once ashore, we were herded into opulent carriages, their velvet seats a cruel mockery of our plight. The journey through the city was short, ending before a gate so grand it swallowed the sky. This was it. The Sultan's palace, the harem. The air within was thick with the scent of rosewater and 100 other perfumes, clashing with the faint metallic tang of fear. Marble gleamed underfoot, reflecting the flickering lamps held by silent eunuchs. Walls adorned with intricate tiles whispered tales of forgotten women. I was no longer in the dirty confines of a slave market. I was in a gilded cage. Other women, some young and trembling, Others older with eyes that held centuries of resignation, watched us from doorways. Their gazes were not welcoming but assessing. Rivals, not sisters. A chill, different from Kaffa's wind, settled deep in my bones. Here, survival would require more than just endurance, it would demand wit, cunning, and a will as unyielding as the palace walls themselves. I, Roxelana, had arrived. The real forging, I knew, was just beginning. The air in the old palace was thick with the scent of jasmine and ambition. From the moment my feet, still aching from the journey, touched the cool marble floors of the harem, I understood I had been traded from one cage to another, albeit a gilded one. The whispers of the elder eunuchs, the suspicious glances of the other women, it all painted a stark picture of my new reality. I was no longer Alexandra, the priest's daughter from Ruthenia, but simply one more body in a sea of them, all vying for the unseen sultan's fleeting gaze. They had explained the rules, not verbally, of course. No one needed to explain. The rules were etched into the very foundations of the palace, mirrored in the stiff smiles and knowing eyes of the women who had already succeeded. My world, once defined by the familiar fields of my homeland, was now reduced to a single terrifying objective: produce a male heir. This was no European court, where a queen held her title, her position secured by birthright and a crown. Here, a queen was a phantom, an empty concept. Instead, there were us, hundreds, perhaps thousands, each a potential vessel for the next prince, each a lottery ticket to a life beyond drudgery. If a woman pleased the sultan, for however brief a time, she might find herself invited to his chambers. If she conceived, her fortunes soared. A son? That was the ultimate prize. Not just for herself, but for her entire lineage, however distant. But the price of that immense elevation was equally stark. My guides, the Khalfa and Ustir who oversaw the harem, had made it clear through their hushed instructions and the way they glanced at the other women. Once a son was born, that was it. No more nights with the sultan. Your womb, now sanctified by the presence of a prince, was to be reserved solely for his well-being. Your duty shifted entirely, from pleasure to education, from passion to politics. You were to live and breathe for your son's advancement, for his climb to the throne. Another child would only dilute your focus, creating rivalry where there should be singular devotion. I watched the older women, those who had already borne sons, move through the courtyard. Their silks were richer, their jewelry more abundant, their steps more confident, yet there was a subtle, almost imperceptible sadness in their eyes. A resignation. They had achieved the pinnacle of their purpose, yet in doing so, they had also sealed their fate, forever bound to the ambition of a child, forever removed from the sultan's touch. Their power was immense, yes, but it was a power born of sacrifice, a cold, calculating power. As I lay on my simple, unadorned bed at night, the silence of the vast palace pressing in on me, I thought of these rules. They were designed to ensure loyalty to the state, to prevent any one woman from gaining too much personal influence over the sultan. They were designed to atomize power, to keep us all as isolated, competing units. But something stirred within me that even the fear of this overwhelming system couldn't quell. A prickle of defiance. I was a woman who had lost everything, yet still possessed a will forged in fire. I was no meek maiden, no easily molded concubine. They wanted a vessel? A womb? Perhaps, but I intended to be so much more. I would not simply bear a son and recede into the shadows, a forgotten mother figure. I would not allow myself to be confined to a life defined solely by a single act of procreation. I would not become another resigned face in the sultan's harem. One way or another, regardless of their rules, I would make them remember the name Roxelana. The others, I noticed, moved with a kind of practiced apathy, their eyes downcast, their voices hushed to a whisper. They sought to blend, to be inconspicuous, to merely survive. Perhaps it was a strategy born of generations of women crushed by the weight of this gilded cage. But that was not my way. My spirit, though battered, refused to be extinguished. I had tasted true loss. the kind that strips away all pretense and leaves only the raw, burning core of self. And that core, for me, was unyielding. I began my silent rebellion not with shouts, but with questions. While others merely nodded or offered pleasantries, I listened intently when the Sultan spoke of state affairs, of the ongoing campaigns, of his vision for the empire. I absorbed every scrap of information, piecing together the intricate tapestry of power and influence. When a moment presented itself, a pause in his monologue, I would offer a thought, a query, something that showed I was not merely a decorative fixture, but a mind engaged and curious. At first, there was surprise in his eyes, a flicker of something akin to intrigue. No one else dared to challenge his narratives, no one else contributed beyond flattery. The whispers in the harem grew sharper, colder. The other concubines, accustomed to their carefully orchestrated routines of submission and quiet competition, viewed me with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. I was an anomaly, a stone in their placid pond. The elder women, the Kalfas, who oversaw our lives with an iron hand disguised in silk, watched me with hawk-like intensity. They knew the rules, had seen countless women rise and fall, and I was breaking their unspoken code of conduct. They expected me to be another faceless girl, grateful for a morsel of royal attention. But I was not grateful. I was hungry, not for bread or jewels, but for a foothold, for a voice, for a future that was undeniably my own. The path ahead was fraught with peril. A single misstep could mean oblivion, but the fire in my belly burned too fiercely to consider retreat. They wanted me to be a vessel? I would be an anchor, and perhaps one day, the very rudder of this magnificent, brutal ship of state. Utter oblivion. A life toiling in the humblest parts of the palace, or worse, being sold away to some provincial lord, far from the light and power that shimmered here in the Topkapi's heart. So I learned. I devoured every lesson, every syllable of Turkish, every nuance of Islamic custom, every intricate detail of court protocol. While others practiced their instruments or their embroidery, I pored over maps, listened intently to the whispers of politics, and memorized the genealogies of foreign kings. My mind, once filled with the pastoral images of my homeland, became a sponge, soaking up the knowledge that would be my armor. The Kalfas, with their knowing eyes, tried to temper my spirit, to mold me into the compliant, graceful figure they expected. They saw my quickness, my audacity, and it unsettled them. A quiet demeanor is a woman's greatest jewel. Hurrem, the chief Kalfa, a woman named Zainab, would often hiss, using the name the Sultan had given me, the joyful one. But I was not quiet. My laughter, when it came, was too bright, my questions too direct. I met the Sultan's gaze, not with downcast eyes, but with a spark that challenged and invited. And it was that spark, I believe, that separated me. While other girls offered practice poses and demure smiles, I offered a mind that craved engagement, a spirit that refused to be dimmed. He saw it, the Sultan Suleiman. He saw the fire beneath the carefully constructed veneer of obedience. His visits to the harem became less about fleeting pleasure and more about conversation, about the exchange of ideas. The other women, once merely suspicious, now regarded me with venomous envy. They saw the shift, the unprecedented attention, the slow, terrifying rise of one who was supposed to be just another ripple in their well-ordered world. A ripple that threatened to become a tidal wave. I was acutely aware that the higher I climbed, the harder the fall could be, but the ground I had left behind was ash. There was only one direction for me now, forward, into the heart of the storm. That understanding, that unspoken challenge, transformed our encounters. The conversations remained, but beneath them, a different current began to flow, one of undeniable intimacy. He didn't just listen to my words, he saw the woman behind them, the fire within. And in the quiet sanctity of his chambers, beyond the prying eyes of the court, a new flame was kindled. The news of my swelling belly rippled through the harem like a tremor before an earthquake. Each morning sickness, each growing curve, was a public declaration, a beacon that drew both awe and intensifying malice. The air crackled with a dangerous anticipation. I knew that what grew within me was not just a child, but a shield, a weapon, a key to a future I could only dream of before. The labor was a torment, a primal scream that tore through me, but with each contraction, I held on to a single defiant thought: a son. Not just any child, but an heir. And then, a cry. Sharp, piercing, undeniably male. He was here. My little prince. My Suleiman, the Sultan, his face etched with a quiet, profound joy, held our son, a miniature of himself, a testament to my power. With that wail, my position shifted irrevocably. The whispers of the other women, once merely venomous, now carried the cold edge of fear. I was no longer just a concubine, but the mother of a sultan's son. I had anchored myself to the very heart of the empire, yet the height of my ascent only made the precipice feel all the more perilous. The whispers changed after Mehmed's birth. Not merely whispers of envy now, but of something deeper, more significant. I had given the Sultan a son, a robust, healthy boy with his father's dark eyes and my own determined chin. Mehmed, my Mehmed. The world had shifted on its axis the moment I held him, binding me to Suleiman in a way no casual visit, no shared laughter ever could. I was no longer just the joyful one, I was the mother of a prince. The joy, however, was laced with an unspoken understanding. The harem was a garden, and a sultan needed many blossoms to ensure a robust lineage. Suleiman already had other sons, other daughters. But then, it happened. A shadow fell over the palace. One by one, 3 of his children, born to other women, succumbed to swift, unnamed illnesses. Grief, stark and chilling, gripped the court. And within that grief, a new, terrifying reality solidified for me. Mehmed was now the second son. The second, it was a terrifying promotion, for it brought with it both power and incredible vulnerability. The Kalfas began to eye me differently, not with their usual veiled disapproval, but with a new, almost pitying deference. They knew the unwritten rules, the ancient rhythm of the harem. A woman fulfilled her purpose, gave a prince, and then, slowly, gracefully, receded. She became part of the past, making way for the new. Suleiman needed more children, more sons, a multitude of spares against the cruel hand of fate. And to secure them, he would need new women. The silence grew heavier in the chambers I now occupied. Chambers that were grander, yes, but felt increasingly like a gilded cage. I saw the calculating glances of the other concubines, fresh blooms waiting for their chance. I felt the weight of tradition pressing down, threatening to flatten me, to extinguish the very spark Suleiman had claimed to cherish. They expected me to accept it, to step aside, to become another quiet mother, watching from the sidelines as others claimed his nights, his days, his future. But I was not quiet. I was not graceful in surrender. My spirit, forged in the ashes of a life stolen, burned hotter now, fueled by the tiny, trusting hand of my son. Step aside? Never. The ground I had left behind was ash, and to recede was to return to that ashes. I had tasted purpose, felt the intoxicating pull of influence. I would not be another ripple. I would be the storm itself. In the quiet, somber moments of the harem, as the Kalfas whispered about the shifting winds of fate, I began to weave a new narrative. It was a dangerous game, one that could shatter the delicate balance of the harem. But I was not one to shy away from risk. My life had taught me that there was no safety in submission, no comfort in silence. I began to entertain, to captivate. The harem was a stage, and I was its star. I danced, sang, and recited poetry with a passion that was both alluring and unsettling. The other concubines, once so eager to usurp my position, now watched me with a mixture of awe and fear. They saw a woman who refused to be defined by her role, who refused to be reduced to a mere vessel for the Sultan's legacy. Suleiman, too, began to take notice. He would come to my chambers not as a lover but as an admirer, a man entranced by the fierce spirit of the woman who had given him a son. He would watch me, his dark eyes shining with admiration, and I would feel a thrill of power, knowing that I held his attention in a way that no other woman could. The whispers grew louder, the intrigue thicker. Some said that I was bewitching the Sultan. that I was using my wiles to secure my position. Others whispered that I was a threat to the stability of the empire, that my ambition was a danger to the delicate balance of power. But I paid them no mind, for I knew that my survival depended on my ability to adapt, to evolve, to be more than just a concubine. And so, I continued to dance, to sing, to weave the threads of my story. The harem was no longer a gilded cage, but a stage upon which I could perform my greatest role. I was Roxelana, the mother of a prince, a woman who refused to be silenced, a force of nature that could not be tamed. As the years passed, and the Sultan's children grew, I remained a constant presence in his life. He never took another wife, never fathered another child. It was as if the world had conspired to grant me my deepest wish, to be the only woman who held his heart, the only mother who could secure his legacy. In the end, it was my defiance, my refusal to accept the role of a submissive concubine, that won me my freedom. When Suleiman died, I was no longer a slave, but a queen in my own right. The empire mourned the loss of its great ruler, but for me, it was a bittersweet moment. For though I had won the heart of the Sultan and the love of my son, I knew that the price of my freedom had been steep. I was a woman who had dared to defy the odds, to rise above the expectations of my station. And though the cost had been high, I would never regret the choices I had made, for in the end, I had become more than just a concubine. I had become a legend. As the years passed and the Sultan's children grew, I remained a constant presence in his life. He never took another wife, never fathered another child. It was as if the world had conspired to grant me my deepest wish, to be the only woman who held his heart, the only mother who could secure his legacy. No longer was I his concubine. I had become his wife. It was a title whispered with awe, sometimes envy, throughout the palace, a testament to the impossible transformation I had wrought. My chambers, once merely luxurious, now held the quiet dignity of a queen's domicile, and my every word carried the weight of the Sultan's ear. As the years melted into decades, the whispers of my past, of the humble origins and the audacious spirit that defied tradition, solidified into legend. I was not just a historical footnote, I was the very fabric of the Sultanate's present, a living monument to a love that scorned convention. His loyalty was a silent, unyielding monument. He never sought another companion for his bed, never desired another mother for his heirs. Our children, now grown and stepping into roles of leadership, were a living testament to our singular bond. They knew no siblings from other unions, no rival mothers vying for their father's affection. This was our kingdom, built not on conquest or bloodlines alone, but on a devotion so profound it reshaped destiny. Sometimes in the quiet of the night, I would trace the lines on my aged hands, remembering the trembling girl who first entered these walls. The cost, as I had known, was high. A life lived under constant scrutiny, every triumph a defiance, every sorrow a private battle. Yet, looking back, watching the legacy we had built thrive, I knew I would not change a single step. I had not just secured a title, I had claimed a destiny, not just for myself, but for the very idea of what a woman could achieve. My heart, I remember, did not leap with the unadulterated joy one might expect. It fluttered, a captured bird, beating against the bars of an even grander cage. Suleiman, my lion, my sultan, had defied centuries for me. He had declared me free, not just of my slave status, but free of the very chains that bound every woman in this empire, the expectation of disposability, of being but one petal in a vast fleeting garden of concubines. He had given me a name no woman had ever held, Haseki Sultan, chief consort, wife. But what did that mean exactly? The title was new, a crown forged from a broken mold. The valid sultan, his mother, had been the first woman, her power derived from motherhood, from custom, from generations of precedents. She had been my quiet instructor, her eyes, though often veiled with a certain cool reserve, held a wisdom I leaned on. She taught me to navigate the treacherous currents of the harem, to understand the subtle language of power and influence. She was a constant. Now she was gone, and I, the barbarian girl from the Ruslands, was left to fill a void that was never meant to be filled by a wife, much less one snatched from the slave market. The whispers followed me like shadows. She manipulated him. She bewitched him. She is a sorceress. The very freedom, the very elevation he bestowed upon me, was immediately twisted into evidence of my cunning, my unnatural ambition. There was no precedent for my position. No established rules of engagement. I was the Sultan's wife, yes, but what power did that grant me beyond the private chambers? Would my sons truly be safer now, or merely more exposed to the envy of those who saw me as an usurper? Every step was a negotiation, every glance an unspoken question. Concubines who had once bowed with practiced deference, now watched me with a glint of fear, or perhaps resentment in their eyes. The eunuchs, masters of the harem's intricate dance, regarded me with a mixture of awe and unease, and the viziers, men steeped in tradition and the rigid hierarchy of the port, undoubtedly saw me as a dangerous anomaly, a breach in the carefully constructed walls of their world. Suleiman had solved one problem perhaps, the security of his dynasty, consolidated through me, through us. But in doing so, he had created another, far grander one, and I was at its perilous center. I was the first, which meant I was also the experiment. And in this empire, experiments often ended with a silken cord, or a swift, silent removal from the stage. No, I did not demand this. I accepted it. And with it, I accepted the isolation, the scrutiny, and the terrifying, breathtaking burden of a power no woman before me had ever dared to dream of, let alone wield. I was Roxelana, the Sultan's wife, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. But the true loneliness, the kind that gnawed at the very marrow of my bones, began not with the decree, but with his departures, the rumble of hooves on the cobbled courtyards, the glint of steel beneath the morning sun, the final, lingering embrace. Each farewell was a rending, a severing of the only true anchor I possessed. Suleiman, my lion, my universe, was the Sultan of the 7 climes, and his campaigns called him away, sometimes for a season, sometimes for a year, sometimes for a stretch that felt like an eternity. When his shadow lengthened on the horizon, taking with it the very light from these immense chambers, the silence that followed was deafening. It was then, in that echoing void, that I would sit, quills scratching on parchment, my thoughts a tumultuous river seeking its distant ocean. Turkish, they said, was not my native tongue, and indeed, my letters were often tangled, a frantic jumble of feelings straining against the confines of a borrowed language. I poured myself onto those pages, each word a desperate plea for connection, across the vastness of plains and mountains. Day and night, my Sultan, I burn in the fire of grief over separation from you, I would write. The words forming a mantra, a truth. They were not mere poetic flourishes, not the refined sentiments of a courtier well versed in flattery. They were the raw, unvarnished cry of a soul adrift. How could they understand, those ambassadors who saw only my cunning? How could they grasp that the grandeur of this palace became a gilded prison when his laughter no longer echoed through its halls, when his hand no longer sought mine in the quiet hours of the night? I wrote of being lost, drowning in the sea of longing, no longer able to tell day from night. The sun rose and set, the muezzin's call drifted from the minarets. The harem buzzed with its ceaseless anxieties and intrigues. But to me, it was all a blur. Time ceased to have meaning without him. My days were marked not by dawn or dusk, but by the weight of his absence, each moment heavier than the last. The duties of my station, overseeing the kitchens, arbitrating disputes among the concubines, instructing the eunuchs, even corresponding with the Grand Vizier on matters of state, became a hollow pantomime. They saw me, the Haseki Sultan, moving through the palace with a calm demeanor, issuing commands, holding court with a certain imperious grace. They saw the power. They did not see me, in the solitude of my chambers, feeling capable of nothing but suffering in his absence. It was a suffering woven into the very fabric of my being, a constant ache that only his return could soothe. The letters, imperfect and rambling as they were my lifeline. They were the only conduit through which I could voice this truth, this deep consuming need for the man who had torn down centuries for me, and in doing so, had made me utterly dependent on his presence. My power was undeniable, yes, but it was a power that often felt like a crushing weight, amplified by the terrifying silence of his absence. I counted the days, the hours, for the messenger who would bring a scrap of his hand, a whisper of his breath, back to me. The scratch of sandaled feet on marble, the hushed announcement, a messenger from the Sultan's camp, these were the only sounds that could pierce the heavy shroud of my despair. My heart would leap, a desperate bird against its cage of ribs. I would snatch the scroll, my fingers trembling as I broke the seal, devouring his words, his script, as if they were water to a parched throat. Each sentence, a balm. Each phrase, a thread pulling me back from the brink of oblivion. He wrote of battles, yes, of conquests and strategy, but also of quiet moments, of missing my harem, of the gardens he imagined we would stroll through upon his return. And in those precious lines, the weight of the palace, the suffocating silence, would lift, if only for a fleeting hour. Yet even his letters, treasured as they were, could not entirely quell the restless churn within me. How could I ensure his return to a household less than perfect? Every tapestry, every cushion, every scent wafting from the kitchens had to be just so. I would sweep through the chambers, my eyes missing nothing. A speck of dust on a polished table, a rose blossom past its prime in a vase, a misplaced rug. "This will not," I would declare, and the servants would scatter, their faces grim, for they knew my standards knew no compromise. My household accounts, of course, reflected this relentless pursuit of flawlessness. The royal treasurer would present his ledgers with a sigh, his brow furrowed, and I, in turn, would sigh deeply, knowing he was right. But could His Majesty return to anything less than perfection? I would counter, my voice firm, already plotting how to justify the expenditure on richer silks for the divans, or more exotic spices for the Sultan's chefs. It was a constant battle, reining in my own impulses, for my heart always demanded the best, for him, for our children, for the very fabric of our lives within these walls. And my children? They were the other sons around which my world revolved. My Mehmet, my Selim, my Mihrimah, and then, my youngest, Bayezid. He was a constant ache, a tender vulnerability in my heart. His left shoulder, perpetually softer, less developed than the right. I would watch him during his lessons, during his play, a perpetual knot of anxiety in my stomach. The court physicians had offered remedies, salves, exercises, all of which I oversaw with meticulous, almost obsessive, attention. I would spend hours with him, massaging the small joint, whispering prayers, urging strength into his delicate frame. "My lion cub," I would murmur, pressing kisses to his brow, a desperate mother's plea against the imperfections of the world. He was so full of spirit, so quick to laugh, yet that slight asymmetry was a constant reminder of life's precariousness, of the things even a sultan's favor could not mend. To my family, to my Suleiman, I was Hurrem, the joyful, the laughing one. And truly, in the embrace of my children, in the quiet confidence of my sultan's love, I was. Their laughter was my music, their happiness my purpose. But the world beyond these private chambers, the world of courtiers and petitioners, of ambassadors and jealous whispers, they saw something else entirely. They saw Ziadi. They saw the witch, the sorceress who had ensnared the great sultan. What else could explain it? I imagined them muttering in hushed tones behind their silken sleeves. This foreign girl, this slave, holding such sway over the commander of the faithful. Their eyes, when they dared to meet mine, held a mixture of fear and grudging respect, never warmth. They saw my undeniable power, the threads of influence I wove through the very tapestry of the empire, but they could not fathom its source was love, devotion, and a desperate perfectionist drive to ensure my beloved returned to a home worthy of him, a family thriving under my vigilant eye. They saw the stern face, the imperious gesture, the unwavering will, but never the woman who, just hours before, had been coaxing a smile from her youngest son, or weeping over a letter from her absent husband, lost and drowning in a sea of longing. The witch, they called me. And perhaps, in the ruthless crucible of this court, to survive, to thrive, to protect what was mine, one had to become a little bit of a witch after all. But the truth was far simpler and far more painful. I was merely a woman, profoundly in love, profoundly afraid, and profoundly alone in the heart of an empire. The weight of the crown was a constant searing ache, a physical manifestation of the expectations that crushed me daily. Every pronouncement, a gamble, every forced smile, a performance. My son, my beautiful, brilliant firstborn, Elian, was the only one who truly saw me, the exhausted woman beneath the regalia. He was my anchor, the heir I sculpted with meticulous care, the living promise of a future I built for his father's return. I poured every ounce of my formidable will into preparing him, teaching him the intricate dance of court, the brutal demands of leadership. He was a beacon, a tangible hope in a world shrouded in uncertainty. Then came the fever. A whisper at first, a child's persistent cough, easily dismissed in the bustling, oblivious palace. But it grew, relentless, consuming him even as court healers faltered, then fled in superstitious dread. I held him, my powerful queen's hands trembling, useless against the encroaching cold. I, who could command armies and reshape decrees, could not command his breath. The witch was powerless. I watched life drain from his eyes, those same knowing eyes that had seen my secret tears, my weary heart. His death was not just a personal grief, it was a political earthquake. The line of succession fractured. My perceived strength mocked by fate. They whispered I was cursed, that my coldness had chilled even my own son's life away. But the truth was, his loss hollowed me out, leaving an echoing cavern where my warmth once resided. It didn't break me entirely, it merely refined the steel, forging a colder, sharper queen. For if my love couldn't save him, then perhaps ruthlessness would save the rest. The news reached me like a burning ember, searing my very soul. The old palace reduced to ash and rubble, 1,000,000 gold pieces, jewels beyond counting, all gone. My heart ached for the immense material loss, but a wave of profound relief washed over me as I clutched my children close. We were safe. We had not been there. Providence, perhaps, or simply the whims of fate, had spared us. Yet, the destruction brought with it a different kind of crisis. The women, hundreds of them, pouring out into the public square, a sight no one had ever witnessed before. Their cries, their confusion, echoed through the city. As head of the old palace, their welfare now fell squarely upon my shoulders. Where would they go? Rebuilding the old palace would take years, and the court could not function without its heart. A solution was needed, and my mind, ever quick, saw not just ruin, but an unprecedented opportunity. Tradition dictated that the Sultan's personal harem resided in the old palace, separate from the new palace, Topkapi, where the Sultan held court and conducted affairs of state. But tradition, I had learned, was a malleable thing, especially when necessity pressed. I approached Suleiman, my voice calm despite the storm within. "My lord," I began, "the old palace is no more. To rebuild now would be a monumental task, and the women, your women, cannot remain displaced. There is but one logical solution." And so, I proposed it, to move the entire imperial harem, not back to a rebuilt old palace, but directly into the new palace, into Topkapi. The whispers, I imagine, were deafening. Never had a sultan's consort, let alone his entire harem, resided within the sacred walls of the imperial residence. But Suleiman, my Suleiman, saw the logic, perhaps even the convenience, of my proposal. And so, the move began. Carpets were laid, chambers prepared, and the laughter and chatter of women, once confined to the distant old palace, now echoed through the very corridors where the empire was governed. I, Roxelana, the former slave girl, now resided not merely as the Sultan's wife, but as the validating presence within Topkapi itself, a queen in all but name, weaving my influence into the very fabric of the state. The fire had taken much, but it had also cleared the path to an unimaginable future. Years folded into one another, each one a testament to the changing tides, to the malleable nature of tradition I had so shrewdly exploited. My position in Topkapi, once a whispered audacity, became an accepted reality, then an undeniable truth. The palace hummed with my presence, the Gran Seraglio no longer a separate entity, but an integrated, pulsing heart of the empire, subtly yet firmly guided by my hand. Suleiman and I, our bond deepened by shared history and political alliance, navigated the intricate currents of state together. The whispers of old, of a mere concubine, faded, replaced by the hushed reverence for Hurrem Sultan, wife, mother, and unofficial co-ruler. But time, relentless in its march, brought with it new challenges, new anxieties that even the security of Topkapi could not quell. My sons, once babes at my breast, blossomed into strapping young men, their voices deepening, their shoulders broadening with the weight of expectation. It was the oldest tradition of our dynasty. A prince, coming of age, was sent to govern a distant province, to learn the art of leadership, to command, to prepare for the mantle of sultanate. This was the custom, and it was a crucible. Mustafa, Suleiman's firstborn, had already walked this path, his mother Mahidevran dutifully by his side in Manisa, guiding him, protecting him from the vultures that circled every potential heir. But I, Roxelana, possessed a singular burden, a unique predicament. I had not one, but multiple beloved sons, each a potential jewel in Suleiman's crown, each deserving of my unwavering support. When Mehmed, my brilliant, earnest Mehmed, reached 21, the designated age for his governorship of Manisa, the traditional seat of the heir apparent, my heart swelled with pride and fractured with dread. He was older than many princes had been upon their departure, a man grown, yet still, in my eyes, my son, my boy. The air in the divan hummed with the news, the courtiers speculating, their eyes darting to me. My firstborn son, leaving my sight, my direct protection, and then, shortly after, Selim, my fiery-haired Selim, at 19, was granted Konya to govern his own province. To accompany them both, to split myself, was an impossibility. My place was here, beside Suleiman, at the very nexus of power, guiding the younger children, Bayezid and Shihangir, who still needed my constant presence, securing our family's future, ensuring my influence remained strong in the capital. The needs of the present, I told myself, outweighed the longings of a mother's heart. I watched them leave, my sons, their caravans disappearing into the dust haze, their faces etched with youthful determination, and, I imagined, a flicker of apprehension. Mehmed, without his mother's daily counsel, without that intimate whisper of advice that only a mother could offer, without my eyes to see the traps laid by ambitious viziers, by jealous rivals. Selim too left to chart his own course in Konya, his quick temper and love of wine a constant worry in my heart. No one, not Suleiman, not I, could truly fathom the impact this distance would have, the shape it would carve into their destinies, into the very future of the Ottoman Empire. All I could do was pray and weave my influence from afar, a desperate web of hope and fear. My heart ached for my absent sons, a hollow space in the bustling palace, a constant dull throb beneath the silks and jewels. But a mother's longing in Topkapi had to find a different outlet, a new channel for its fierce protectiveness. If I could not physically be with Mehmed and Selim, to guide their steps and parry the subtle blows of their rivals, I would extend my influence in ways few women, even those of royal birth, had ever dared. It was then that my pen became an extension of my will, my words traveling on the fastest horses, across vast deserts and treacherous seas. I began to correspond, not merely with Suleiman's advisors, but with the crowned heads and powerful women of other nations. My most determined ally became Isabella, the disputed Queen of Hungary, a woman I saw as a kindred spirit, battling male ambition and external threats to secure her son's future. Against the grasping Habsburgs, I pledged my quiet support, weaving diplomatic threads that bolstered her claim, knowing that a stable, friendly Hungary served our own imperial interests. Later, my letters spanned the distant courts of Europe and Asia, reaching the Polish monarchs, seeking their neutrality, perhaps even their favor. I exchanged carefully crafted missives with the royal women of Safavid Persia, probing for common ground, for avenues to ease the constant tension between our empires. If Suleiman warred with their men, perhaps our women could forge a different kind of peace. A hidden understanding. While I sharpened my quill and my mind, Suleiman pursued his tireless campaigns, pushing the boundaries of our empire ever further west. The news of his triumphs was a constant thrumming rhythm in the palace. Reports of cities falling, armies scattering before his might. He threatened Vienna, a city then imagined only as a distant bastion of the Habsburgs, their very walls trembling at the thunder of his cannons. I pictured the dread in their gilded halls, the sheer audacity of our advance, and felt a fierce, almost savage pride that such a man was my Suleiman, and his empire, a vast, undeniable inheritance for my sons. He was the world's conqueror, and I, his harem, was the hidden hand that shaped its destinies. But the universe, in its cruel indifference, cares nothing for pride or power. The very ground, which had seemed so firm beneath my feet, suddenly fractured. News, carried by a rider whose speed spoke of urgency, then danger, reached us. It was not of a new conquest, but of a terrible illness. Mehmed. My Mehmed. He had been in Manisa for barely a year, a fledgling governor, still finding his feet, still adjusting to the solitude of command. 6 days. 6 tormenting days, the messenger reported. His voice choked with feigned sorrow, or perhaps genuine fear. 6 days of fever, of pain, of a strength that ebbed so swiftly, so inexplicably. My firstborn son, my brilliant, earnest Mehmed, dead. The world tilted. The vibrant colors of the palace dulled to grey. The joyous hum of activity became a deafening silence. It could not be true, not Mehmed, so full of promise, so destined for greatness. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, a betrayal, a poison. Could it be a natural illness, the plague, or the machinations of those who feared his ascendancy? I had worried, I had prayed, I had tried to weave my influence from afar, but it was not enough. I had not been there. I had not protected him. The triumphant roar of Suleiman's cannons, threatening distant Vienna, faded into a meaningless echo. All that remained was the silence where my Mehmed's laughter should have been, the cold, hollow space in my heart where his vibrant spirit had resided. The future, which I had so meticulously planned and fought for, had just been ripped from my grasp, leaving behind only the unbearable weight of loss. I felt the very breath leave my body, replaced by a suffocating emptiness. The ornate walls of my chambers, once a testament to my power, now mocked me with their indifferent beauty. Every tapestry, every gilded frame, seemed to whisper his name, a cruel reminder of what was lost. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with a cold, desperate rage. Rage at fate, at the unseen hand that had plucked my brightest star from the sky. Suleiman, oblivious in his distant war tent, would return to a throne room shattered, to a mother broken. But my sorrow was more than just a mother's lament. It was the unraveling of everything I had built, every sacrifice I had made. Without Mehmed, my anchor, my hope, what was I? A ship adrift in a storm, with treacherous currents already beginning to pull at the hull. This was not merely the end of a life, it was the beginning of an abyss, and I could already feel its cold, inevitable embrace. The silence of the court chroniclers regarding my grief was not an oversight, but a testament to how profoundly I felt it. While Suleiman, my lion, tore at his robes and refused the sun, his sorrow a public declaration, mine was a gnawing internal beast. It clawed at my spirit in the dead of night, in the hollow passages of the harem, in the empty space beside me in our bed. Mehmed, my brave, brilliant Mehmed, the firstborn son of my freedom, my heart's true vessel. To lose him unexpectedly, a sudden fever that consumed his vibrant youth, was to have a limb torn from my very soul. They recorded Suleiman's endless prayers, his days of seclusion, his refusal to countenance a world without our beloved prince. But what words could capture the way my breath hitched with every memory, or the phantom weight of his small hand in mine? No, my sorrow was not for public consumption, it was a sacred, searing wound I carried within. It was this unbearable pain, this silent scream, that hardened into resolve, a monument. Not merely a tomb, but a beacon of his memory, a testament to the promise that had been extinguished too soon. The great imperial architect was summoned, plans unfurled, and the foundation stones of the Sazed Mosque began to rise, brick by painstaking brick, a colossal ache-given form. I watched them, the Janissaries, powerful men in their own right, yet their feet, calloused and weary, shuffled in worn-out inadequate shoes as they hauled stone and mixed mortar under the unforgiving sun. My heart, still raw from loss, stirred with a different kind of ache, one of compassion, and a fierce desire to honor the labor that honored my son. My coffers, unlike my heart, were not empty, far from it. That daily stipend of 2,000 silver aspers, a sum so vast it rendered the 20 aspers of an ordinary concubine mother into a pittance, and dwarfed even the allowances of Suleiman's own sisters. I held wealth that could rival small kingdoms, a river of silver that flowed through my hands, not merely for silks and jewels, though I indulged in those too. But it was this very silver that became the bedrock of my power, an extension of my will. And so, without hesitation, I ordered the sale of my most exquisite jewels. Rubies like drops of Mehmed's young blood, emeralds the color of the promised land, pearls that shimmered like moon-kissed tears. They were beautiful, yes, but what were they against the dignity of a man earning his bread, or the shadow of my son's legacy? The whispers grew louder in the harem. Roxelana gives away her treasures. But I cared not. The additional coin went directly to those Janissaries, a raise that allowed them decent shoes, better food, a small measure of comfort in their arduous task. It was not charity, not truly. It was an investment in the human spirit, an acknowledgement of their worth, and a silent promise that my son's memorial would be built on foundations of respect, not hardship. This was but one facet of my fortune's true purpose. My wealth was a tool, not a gilded cage. It allowed me to not only live in the splendor befitting the Valid Sultan, but to weave a tapestry of influence far beyond the harem walls. Gifts flowed from my hands to foreign monarchs, precious silks to the Venetian Doge, rare spices to the Safavid Shah. Softening relations, securing alliances, subtly advancing the interests of our empire, and by extension, my own position. And beyond the political, my soul yearned to give back, to leave a mark that would endure for generations. The hostels for pilgrims, not merely in the grand cities, but in the sacred heartlands of Mecca and Medina, rose from my vision and my silver. They were not just buildings, they were havens, places of rest and sanctity for countless souls on their spiritual journeys, each stone a silent prayer whispered in my name, a legacy far more enduring than any earthly jewel. My grief for Mehmed was a private pain, but the power it unleashed, the compassion it ignited, reshaped the world around me, stone by precious stone. Yet even as the foundations of Mehmed's mosque rose, a chill wind swept through the palace, carrying whispers more dangerous than swords. Mustafa. The name, once a distant echo, now boomed through the chambers, magnified by the growing discontent of the Janissaries. They adored him, these hardened soldiers, saw in him the strength of his father in his youth, a true heir to the warrior throne. Suleiman, my lion, was indeed growing older, his campaigns more arduous, his return journey shadowed by weariness. The succession, once a distant worry, now hung heavy, a poisoned fruit dangling above our heads. Mehmed was gone, and Mustafa, though of another mother, was the undeniable favorite of the army, a powerful rival to my sons, to Bayezid, to Selim. Would Suleiman truly break with tradition and name one heir, or would he allow the viper's nest to truly erupt? Would my sons be forced to wage war against their elder half-brother, then against each other? The thought was a dagger to my heart, a stark reminder of the brutal realities of this gilded cage. I had secured my position, defied centuries of custom, not for myself alone but for them, for the future of my bloodline. Then came the reports, insidious as poison. The army was restless, emboldened by their loyalty to Mustafa, murmuring that Suleiman was old and weak, that it was time for a change, time for Mustafa to seize the throne. A coup, even while the Sultan still breathed. Suleiman, who had faced down empires and conquered nations, felt the tremor of betrayal from within his own ranks. The summons was issued. Mustafa was to meet his father. I heard the advice given to him, the desperate pleas of his mother, Mahidevran, echoing through the harem walls as if she hoped they might reach my ears and move my heart. "Do not go, my son," they cried. "It is a trap." But he went, stubborn, blinded by a misplaced sense of honor, or perhaps an arrogance born of his popularity. He walked into the lion's den, not knowing that the lion himself felt threatened unto death. When the news reached me, it was not with a shock but with a cold, clear clarity. Mustafa was dead, strangled, by his own father's command. The court was plunged into a morbid silence, a collective holding of breath. Suleiman, as always, publicly raged, tearing at his robes, his sorrow a dramatic performance for the masses, a justification perhaps, for an act that would forever stain his reign. Some whispered of my hand in it, of letters twisted, of truths distorted. Let them whisper. Their words were dust compared to the weight of the crown, compared to the grim necessity of survival. My own reaction was a complex tapestry. There was no joy, no triumphant dance over his grave. Such an act was too grave, too final. But there was a profound, chilling relief. A major threat, the most potent rival to my sons, was gone. The path, though still fraught with peril from within my own brood, had been cleared of its greatest external obstacle. This was the price of power, the gruesome reality of this dynasty. It was not enough to merely survive, one had to eliminate. I looked at my sons. Bayezid, fiery and impetuous; Selim, thoughtful but perhaps too fond of the grape. Now, the battlefield of succession was confined to them. The thought was a new, insidious fear, replacing the old. For Mustafa's death had not ended the struggle, it had merely shifted its battleground. And I, Roxelana, who had moved mountains and sold my very soul to protect her lineage, would now have to ensure they did not destroy themselves, or each other, in the brutal quest for their father's throne. The stakes had never been higher, and my resolution, forged in Mehmed's grave and hardened by Mustafa's, was absolute. The silence that followed Mustafa's demise was not the peace I craved, but a dreadful, suffocating hush, pregnant with accusation. The streets of Istanbul, usually vibrant with the clamor of merchants and the murmur of life, seemed to hold their breath, exhaling only whispers that coiled like vipers around my name. Witch, schemer, destroyer of the bloodline. They spoke of a grand vizier, of letters and poisons, but always, always my name was uttered with the most venom. I, Roxelana, the foreign concubine who had bewitched the Sultan, twisting his mind, turning him against his own flesh and blood. She wants her son on the throne, they hissed, as if it were a crime, not a mother's most desperate prayer. Their murmurings were the distant buzzing of flies to me. What did they know of the weight of this crown, the ruthless machinery of this empire, the unforgiving demands of power? They painted me as a manipulative sorceress, yet they failed to see the Sultan, my Suleiman, for what he truly was. A man who had reigned with unyielding authority for decades, a mind as sharp and formidable as any blade. Whatever counsel I may have offered, whatever truths or suspicions I may have laid before him, the final chilling command was his alone. He was no fool to be swayed by a woman's whim against the interests of his dynasty. He had made his choice, a decision born of perceived necessity, a desperate act to defend his throne from the shadows of treason. Mustafa was gone, a martyr in the eyes of the people, a tragic figure destined to haunt the very foundations of the palace. His death, however devastating, had clarified one grim certainty: only my sons remained. No other contenders. The path to the Golden Throne now lay solely through my bloodline. A strange, hollow victory. For the traditions of this cursed empire decreed that I, their mother, would be privileged to watch them tear each other apart, for the very prize I had fought so ferociously to secure for them. I looked at them then, my remaining sons. Selim, the eldest, with his thoughtful gaze and a quiet fondness for the grape, perhaps too gentle for the viper's nest of court, yet with a core of surprising resilience. Bayezid, younger, fiery and impetuous, a warrior's spirit burning bright, quick to anger, quick to action. And Chihangir, my youngest, my sweet, fragile Chihangir, whose twisted spine held him ever so slightly apart from the others, yet whose mind was the sharpest, whose wit was the quickest, whose heart was the softest. Which of them, I wondered in the dark hours, would be the survivor? Which of them would have to slay his brother? And which, tragically, would be slain? Neither Suleiman nor I ever spoke of a favorite, though the court gossiped endlessly, trying to divine our preferences from a glance, a gesture, a whispered word. How could one choose? They were all fragments of my very soul, each beloved, each a terrifying risk. Then, inevitably, the axe fell again, though this time it was not the Sultan's command, nor the executioner's rope. Chihangir, my beautiful, brilliant Chihangir, was taken by a sudden sickness. A fever, they said. A cough that worsened, a breath that struggled. He wasted away with a speed that defied all remedies, all prayers. Was it grief for his brother Mustafa, whom he had idolized? The whispers suggested it, claiming his sensitive nature could not bear the brutality. Or was it simply the cruel hand of fate, another blow in a life steeped in sorrow and political intrigue? I held him, his small, frail body growing cold in my arms, and a different kind of grief tore through me. Mustafa's death had been a grim necessity, a strategic, if brutal, clearance of an obstacle. Chihangir's was pure, unadulterated loss, a mother's heart breaking for her most vulnerable child. He would not have to fight, he would not have to kill, nor be killed, by his own kin. A twisted, horrifying mercy perhaps. He found his peace. We buried him in Istanbul, next to his elder brother, Mehmed, a poignant symmetry of youthful promise extinguished too soon. Today a neighborhood bears his name, a small, enduring whisper of a boy who might have ruled, had fate, and the merciless nature of this throne, been kinder. Now, only Selim and Bayezid remained, two lions snarling at each other from across the vast chambers of the palace, their rivalry a palpable tension that crackled in the very air. The field had been cleared, but the battle had only just begun. And I, Roxelana, the woman who had clawed her way from slavery to the pinnacle of power, understood that my greatest test was yet to come. I had protected them from the outside world, but how could I protect them from each other? I had to ensure that one of my sons sat upon the throne. And if that meant steeling my heart against the inevitable fratricide, then so be it. The survival of my bloodline, the legacy I had poured my very life into, demanded nothing less. The games continued, and I would play them to the bitter end. In the dimly lit corridors of the palace, I walked with a heavy heart, my steps echoing in the silence that now pervaded the halls. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken words, the tension between my sons, a palpable force that threatened to tear the very fabric of our family apart. I found myself drawn to the gardens, where the scent of jasmine and roses provided a brief respite from the oppressive atmosphere within the palace walls. It was here, under the watchful gaze of the moon, that I would often retreat to gather my thoughts and find solace in the quiet beauty of the night. As I sat on a marble bench, my fingers tracing the intricate patterns etched into the stone, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a mistake. Had I, in my quest for power, unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the destruction of my family? Had my ambition blinded me to the consequences of my actions? I closed my eyes and tried to remember the girl I once was, the one who had been ripped away from her homeland and thrust into a world of opulence and danger. A girl who had dared to dream of a better life, of a future where she could be more than just a slave. A girl who had become a woman, a mother, and a queen. But even as I tried to cling to those memories, the harsh reality of the present intruded upon my thoughts. The whispering voices of the courtiers, the scheming ambitions of my sons, the looming spectre of war and bloodshed, they all served as a stark reminder of the brutal nature of this world. I felt the very breath leave my body, replaced by a suffocating emptiness. The ornate walls of my chambers, once a testament to my power, now mocked me with their indifferent beauty. Every tapestry, every gilded frame, seemed to whisper his name, a cruel reminder of what was lost. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with a cold, desperate rage. rage at fate, at the unseen hand that had plucked my brightest star from the sky. Suleiman, oblivious in his distant war tent, would return to a throne room shattered, to a mother broken. But my sorrow was more than just a mother's lament. It was the unraveling of everything I had built, every sacrifice I had made. Without Mehmed, my anchor, my hope, what was I? A ship adrift in a storm, with treacherous currents already beginning to pull at the hull. This was not merely the end of a life, it was the beginning of an abyss, and I could already feel its cold, inevitable embrace. Epilogue. They say a woman's true power lies not in her youth, but in the wisdom etched by time, in the invisible threads she weaves within the grand tapestry of power. In her chambers within the sprawling labyrinth of the old palace, where once she had been brought as a trembling slave, Roxelana, the mighty harem's sultan, spent her final years wielding influence, not with grand declarations, but with the quiet potency of a quill. Her hand, no longer clumsy with foreign script, danced across the parchment, each stroke a testament to decades spent mastering not just a language, but an empire. The salutations remained a cascade of fawning devotion, an exquisite tapestry of flowery praise for her son of the world, her sultan of sultans, Suleiman the Magnificent. But beneath the embellishments, a sharper, more perceptive political mind hummed. Her words whispered of unrest in the seraglio, of shifting loyalties and the subtle poisons of ambition that brewed amongst the viziers and pashas. With a delicate touch she would nudge, subtly suggesting the wisdom of recalling this or that exiled Grand Vizier, hinting at their forgotten loyalty, their irreplaceable acumen, always framing it as a benefit to his glorious reign. The court, she conveyed, was a tempest held barely at bay, and only his steady hand, guided by her humble counsel, could navigate its treacherous currents. And then there were their sons. The delicate dance of parental pleading, placating his mounting suspicions over the spirited Bayezid. The quiet, ambitious Selim, my lion, she would write of one, explaining away youthful impetuousness as a fiery spirit. For another, his thoughtful silences merely mask a keen intellect, waiting to serve his sovereign. She was the protective she-wolf, her words a shield against the paternal judgment that could, and often did, mean death. But most tenderly, most urgently, her concern for Suleiman himself bled onto the page. His lingering coughs, the weariness in his eyes she sometimes glimpsed during his rare visits, the increasing fragility that age, relentless and unforgiving, was carving into his once indomitable frame. "May Allah grant my sultan endless health and vigor," she penned, her own heart aching with a premonition of loss, "for the world trembles without your light." Yet, the cruel irony of fate would strike first at her own formidable spirit. A slow, insidious ailment began to consume her, a dwindling fire within that even her iron will could not stoke. The woman who had captivated a sultan, survived the treacherous currents of the harem, and held the threads of an empire, found herself battling a foe she could not outwit. On April 15, 1558, within the very walls of the old palace where her journey had begun as merely a girl named Alexandra, she drew her last breath. The air, heavy with the scent of jasmine and sorrow, seemed to still. The harem wept not for a sultan's concubine, but for a mother, a friend, a force of nature. The news reached Suleiman like a fatal blow. The whispers were undeniable. The sultan loved her to distraction, and his heart has broken with her death. His once unyielding gaze was clouded with a grief that few had ever dared imagine possible. The Ottoman Empire had lost its most unconventional, most beloved empress, and its sultan, his anchor. But the story, alas, did not end with noble grief. The threads Roxelana had held so carefully, so desperately, began to unravel with terrifying speed. Perhaps, in the quietude of her final moments, she found a strange mercy in departure. Perhaps she was spared the unbearable spectacle that would soon unfold, the brutal consequence of a dynasty waiting simply for her presence to hold the fragile peace. Within months of her passing, the simmering rivalries ignited. Bayezid, the fiery prince, perhaps feeling the absence of his mother's steadying hand, began raising an army, challenging the established order she had fought so hard to maintain. He lost, fled to Iran, a desperate exile. But even across borders, the Sultan's reach was long, his sorrow-fueled wrath absolute. Suleiman, broken by the loss of his harem, yet driven by the unyielding demands of his empire, ransomed his own son, then executed him as a rebel, a father's hand delivering a son's demise, a horror Roxelana had striven, perhaps unconsciously, to prevent merely by living. 8 years later, when Suleiman himself finally succumbed to the weight of his crown and his grief, it was Selim, the sot, as some would later call him, the quietly ambitious son Roxelana had so often defended, who inherited the vast empire. He was the sole survivor of a fraternal war that Roxelana's life had, perhaps, merely postponed. One could almost believe that even in death, Roxelana offered one final, profound protection to her spirit, the mercy of not witnessing her husband and her sons, the men she had loved and fought for, destroy each other over the very throne she had helped secure for them.